because I think you have to have lived first. You have to have suffered getting up at 8 o'clock in the morning, as it is in England. It's earlier here, I know, and going to work and knowing it's for the rest of your life and feeling that terrible despair because you're not enjoying it, but you have to earn your living. You have to have had your heart broken by a bastard, or how can you write about love? You have to have found real love as well, or how can you write about love? So I'm not terribly keen on young persons of 18 being given monster advances to write a book that is supposed to be brilliant. How can it be? They're 18. They can't have lived enough. I was 35. I had no children and wasn't married and had no other dependents either. And sadly, I do think that that's important, because if I had felt I was responsible to anybody else, I couldn't have taken the risk that I then did take, which was to tell myself I'd always wanted to be a writer, and now was the time to give it a go. And then if it didn't work, I'd know I'd tried, and if it did work, it would be wonderful. So as a second stage, I set out to do that, and it took me 5 years to have my first book published. So that's where the sad story comes in. The story of struggle, the story of walking the streets of London with my head down after it had rained in case anyone had dropped 10 pence for me to pick up, because I was so poor.
Kind of coming down to whether you could actually, keep a roof over your head at the bitter end.
It was literally that, yes. I had a small flat, which is to some extent the origin of Falco's horrible flat in the Aventine. It wasn't horrible, but it had strange quirks, and one of the quirks was that part of the roof was slate, and the slate had reached the end of its life, which it does. It's a wonderful material, but after about 150 years it crumbles away and looks dangerously like asbestos dust, which was slightly worrying, but though it wasn't. And I couldn't afford to get the roof over my head, literally, at that point. I was doing part-time jobs and anything I could find to keep going. I was happy. It's a sad story, but from the moment I left work, I had a smile on my face, because I'd left behind the torture of being one of Mrs. Thatcher's minions. But it was the fact that it was taking me so long, and that I was really running out of all my resources. I'd used my savings. I couldn't continue with life unless I got either a proper job or I sold some work. I was trying to write historical novels. I was trying to write about the English Civil War of the 17th century.
I remember the English Civil War.
A wonderful period of history.
Well, and it's been the fodder of romance, but I found it interesting, just as an aside, that nobody has really ever successfully written crime set in the 17th century. It just does not work. There have been some novels, but they've never gone anywhere. People have never been able to establish any kind of series or body of work in mystery in that one century. And why is it, I wonder?
Other parts of the century, the restoration of Charles II, I would have thought would be a good setting, and the people have tried it. I don't think you could set light crime, the kind of crime I write, in a period as truly terrible as the English Civil War.
And that could
people were suffering too much.
Could well be. I also think that the Tudor and the 18th century, which are the two that sort of are the biggest, or the medieval, there's a lot of business, meaning a lot of money. And I think the 17th century was not as a commercial. I mean, it was a civil war. It was a huge amount of other stuff.
It's a whole 100 years. The latter half of it, I think, would work. I don't want to do it myself, but people were starting to trade. Right. There were all sorts of interesting things. There was America lurking. You could bring that in wonderfully if anybody wanted to do it, which would be a change from what I normally recommend would-be authors to do, which is the Hittites.
Well, sorry, that was a digression.
That's an aside.
It is. To your story.
Anyway, the English Civil War, I managed to sell serials to magazines, but they were not particularly strong. They were good enough for magazine fiction, but they were not going to be published as books, and I came to see that. So I looked for a completely different period, and being a foolish young thing who didn't know the rules, I thought that you should find something all of your own that nobody else was doing. This is completely wrong, of course. Would-be writers should copy somebody else, and then publishers will respond with, oh yes, it's like so-and-so, and they understand it, and that's fine. But when I decided I would write about the Romans, this was horrifying to publishers. They knew of nothing except either Mary Renault, well, she was writing a kind of literary fiction that I don't do, or Robert Graves, who was even more literary, but who had been on TV with that wonderful series of I, Claudius and Claudius the God, with Derek Jacobi, Brother Cadfael. Strange little loop that is.
It is.
The first book I wrote was not a crime novel at all. It was in what I thought was my field. It was a love story, and it was the love story of the Emperor Vespasian and his mistress, who'd been a slave, so he couldn't marry her. They had an on-off relationship over decades, which I wrote as a novel called The Course of Honour, which I still think is my best book, and which nobody would publish because a love story about the Romans just was too frightening. They thought the public couldn't take it. Arising out of the research I did for ancient Rome in particular, the big city that was so dangerous they wouldn't go out to dinner without writing their will in case they were killed in the streets. From that came Falco, and the idea that I would take a kind of 1940s style of Gumshoe, though he wouldn't have read the book, so he wouldn't know what was really expected of him, and set him 2,000 years ago for a joke.
I think it is a wonderful joke to have this Gumshoe, this sort of modern character. I used to call him the sandaled sleuth, or we used to call him, you know, but
the togaed tech.
Oh, I didn't know that one.
Oh, somebody called him that, yes.
I missed that one.
It looks very strange on the page because you have to have an apostrophe in togaed, apparently.
No, yes, it doesn't speak well. But I mean, it is a lovely joke, and it does also create a very interesting voice, in that you can write a kind of, you know, modern vernacular and yet stay within a Roman feeling.
Not everybody can take it, but it seems to me that at any period of history, the people then thought they were modern. They didn't want to sound quaint. They talked as they talked, and everybody could understand it. And that's what I have always done. I think you avoid anachronisms, or screaming anachronisms. But to be in a big city and to talk city talk seemed to flow naturally. What I didn't think about was writing it in the first person. It just came to me naturally because I grew up with the radio, where quite often there'd been radio serials about detectives with a voiceover, the man speaking. And that seemed to fit for Falco, and I did it without thinking that 20 books later I'd still be stuck there, and everything that ever happens to Falco he's either got to see it himself or have described to him by somebody else, which is a fairly rigid sort of way of writing, and I don't know if I would have done it if I'd considered it.
Well, it gives an immediacy to, you know, to the narrative there. I mean, there's a lot to be gained from a first-person narrative.
It's very, very direct, very vivid.
It is, but at the same time, you're absolutely right. It's very limiting for a detective, since all clues and information have to come to him in some fashion. But then and again, I think one of the pluses is it forces you then to create, you know, scenes, dialogue, and all where people are telling him things rather than you're sort of boringly recounting it. And that's a trap of third person, is that there are going to be too much author and too little character, because it's so easy to tell the story from the author's point of view. And
I find that in third persons, detective stories especially, there are a lot of people sitting around talking, which goes on for pages and pages and pages, whereas with Falco he's telling the story, so he can dart off into any little aside. He has a bit of a butterfly mind, for one thing, and that gives it more variety. What people always say is, how can a woman write as a man? Some people say that, and what I always say is, well, I know some. I know what they're like.
I never dared say that to you. Actually, to be honest with you, I've never even thought of it. It never even occurred to me as an issue.
People are surprised. And if you think about it, there are very few male authors who can do women well, or could write in the first person as a woman. I can't actually think of a novel by a man where it's a female protagonist talking to you.